we go. And before we get started, also, I want to recognize that this has been an intense time for a lot of people. My mind has definitely been on the news and just feeling a little bit anxious about everything that's going on and feeling hopeful in some ways and scared in other ways. And I want to take a minute before we get started with tonight's class to have a moment of silence for all of the people and families whose lives are affected by police violence, and to hold in our hearts the people who are grieving right now for the loss of loved ones, and the feeling of unsafety from police violence. And so I want to just take a second to be quiet, and everyone send your thoughts and hearts out to those who have been affected. I also want to just say that it feels a little bit weird to be at a time of such anxiety and with so much going on. It feels a little bit weird to be talking about connecting with plants. In a way, it seems like a kind of off topic as far as what's going on in the world right now. But I also feel personally, and for most other people I know who work with plants, that a lot of times connection with plants can be a way that we heal, and a way that we hold ourselves in a comforting and healing space when things are hard, when there's a lot of anxiety, when there's a lot of grief. And so I hope that some of these tools will be helpful for folks who are experiencing any of those things right now. I hope that that connecting more with plants will help us to stay grounded and to be able to do the work that we need to do, whatever that is for you, whatever that means for you. So it feels both appropriate and inappropriate to talk about this topic right now, but I hope that you all find something that is meaningful to you given the current climate. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Holly. I work as an herbalist in DC in Columbia Heights, and I grow herbs in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. And I've been growing medicinal herbs for about 10 years, and I've had an herbal clinical practice for about the same amount of time. And I also do a lot of teaching outdoors and indoors about plants and their healing properties, and foraging, and ways that we can connect with the natural world beyond some of the ways that we've been taught to connect. And I see there's just a few of us in the class tonight, so I want everyone to feel extra encouraged to speak up and ask questions. And I know that this is a class for gardeners, so I will assume that folks in this Zoom session have some interest in, or some experience with, or maybe a little bit of both in growing plants and gardening. So I'm going to try to speak to that a lot, to kind of using gardening as a tool for connecting. So what we're going to talk about tonight is some of the context for how we've become so disconnected from the natural world. We're going to talk a little bit about why that connection is important, and then we're going to talk about some of the things that I have found helpful for myself and for other people in creating more of a deep connection with the plants that are around us, and that extends to other parts of the natural world as well. So I'm going to start out by talking about some of the cultural forces that I personally have found have affected the way that I interact with plants. And this is both as an herbalist and also as a naturalist, as someone who spends a lot of time learning and teaching about not just how to use medicinal herbs, but just about the plants and the natural world around us. And so a really important process for me over the last bunch of years has been trying to question some of the values that I've been taught around around how I view the world, and wondering how those values have impacted my interactions with plants and with the natural world in general. And so I'm going to share some of those things. And I'm going to start with talking about what are the values that I feel have impacted my connection to plants in a negative way. And then we're going to talk about some of the positive ways that we can counter that. So some of the context that I've been thinking about and observing and talking about with other people is that the relationships that I have with plants are influenced by a lot of different dominant forces in our culture and in our political and economic systems. So I think a lot about the role that capitalism plays in those relationships, which is a system that tends to see everything in the world as a resource to be consumed or to be sold, to be commodified, instead of looking at other living beings as organisms that I am in relationship with through ecosystems and part of a greater living whole in conjunction with these other living organisms. And so shifting my mind from a mindset of what can I take, what can I get from these plants, more to what is my relationship like with them and what do we do for each other, has been really important for me. Whoops. Another thing that has been really personally important for me, and I want to recognize that with the next two, that everyone on the call has a different relationship to these cultural forces or to these phenomena. And so I'm speaking from my own experience, but I think that these next two forces are important in shaping the way that that plants and the natural world are seen in general. But I just want to recognize that my experience as the descendant of settlers is different necessarily from other folks's, and might be the same for some people on the call. And so I want to recognize that one of the things that I have learned as the descendant of colonizers is that the land we are on is ours to exploit and to use, versus the land is part of a living whole, that we are in relationship with all of the other organisms and with the land, and that we can intentionally think about how that relationship is healthy and how that relationship is not healthy. And another force that I have tried to learn some about and tried to investigate the ways that it impacts my relationship with plants is the idea of white culture hegemony. So the idea that the ways of interacting with plants that are dictated by capitalism and colonialism are the correct ways, and that other ways of seeing the world and other ways of seeing plants and the natural world and animals are quaint or ignorant or backward or cute, at best kind of cute and quaint, and at worst savage and backward. And so I was definitely raised with the idea that that my way of seeing the world is the only right way, and am constantly trying to wonder if my interactions with plants and with the natural world are stemming from that kind of perspective, or if they're stemming from something that I'm experiencing directly as a human in relationship to ecosystems and organisms. On that note, I want to lift up the work of Wendy Genius, who wrote this book called Our Knowledge is Not Primitive, Decolonizing Botanical Anishinaabe Teachings. And this is a book that really goes into the process by which Indigenous knowledge was recorded and taken by white settlers over the course of many, many years, and changed into knowledge that comes from that colonialist perspective, and then in a lot of times given back to those same communities in an altered form because of the way that colonialism changes information. And so I'm going to recommend a few different books during the presentation that I hope folks will find useful in thinking about these things. And this is one that definitely really cuts to the heart of what information is deemed valid and what information is deemed invalid by the dominant culture, and how there are many, many different ways of knowing about plants and relating to plants that might fall inside or might fall outside those normative structures. So I wanna pause here. So I think that I tend to with this stuff jump right into the meat of what I'm thinking about, and I want to pause here to see to ask what are some of the ways that you see these forces, or really what are some of the ways that you see other cultural or political or economic forces playing into your relationship with plants. And I'd like everyone to just take a moment to think about that. And I would love if there was a couple of people who wanted to share their thoughts here, either in the chat, and then I'll read those, um, or by unmuting yourself and sharing your thoughts or sharing your comments or questions for folks. So I'll give a second for that. Anyone have something they'd like to share? Okay, I'll move on. But this is something that again, has been a process for me of thinking about these things and trying to figure out their impacts. And so I encourage folks to think about this continually and wonder about how these forces impact your relationships. So stemming from those, especially the kind of values of capitalism, stemming from those ideas that we were just talking about, I wanted to recognize that these are that in a lot of ways there are big companies that are mediating the relationships that we have with plants, that are because we rely on plants for most of our basic needs. In this case, food and medicine and clothing and aesthetics, that there are a lot of people making a lot of money off of our need for plants. And my idea here is not to say that we shouldn't go to the grocery store or that we shouldn't buy medicinal herbs or that we shouldn't buy flowers, but that there are a lot of connections to be made with the natural world and with plants that that get obscured by the fact that most of the things we need are available for purchase. And so in this case, we have food, where the grocery store is the mediator of most of our relationships with the plants that we eat. Up on the top right, we have the example of medicine. And I like this example in particular because the herb on the left is dandelion root, which is a plant that most people can recognize and that is growing everywhere in DC, and pretty much everywhere that has been mowed or otherwise disturbed by humans. And for the majority of people who use dandelion root as a medicinal herb, they probably had the experience of purchasing it. And I think that that's another example of how sometimes there is a company in between us and a plant that is sort of mediating our relationship with that plant. On the bottom left here is the example of clothing. Here we have a relationship with plants that I think we don't think about very often, which is the fact that we often wear, in particular, two major plant fibers, flax and cotton, that we are often in direct contact physically with plants for a full day and not really thinking about the fact that we are wearing them. And then on the bottom right, we have flowers. And I think that one of the ways that that the commodification of flowers impacts our relationship to plants is that it is often seen as kind of like lesser or not as meaningful if you pick a bouquet of flowers for someone and give them a bouquet of flowers versus buying a bouquet of flowers from the store. It's often seen as cheap, when really picking a bouquet of flowers can be a really beautiful experience, and also takes time and takes a lot of thought. And I would love to see that to be more normal than buying flowers at the grocery store and handing them over to someone. We have Janie in the chat saying, a little late for the discussion, yet I believe we are being dominated by the pharmaceutical industrial complex, which controls our seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, food additives, and then our medicines. And so going back to the moment where I was asking for some examples, that's a really great example that that we have a system where a lot of resources, a lot of especially oil-based resources or petroleum-based resources are used to grow food for us. And there's a lot of corporate interests there between ourselves and the food that we eat that definitely change our food systems and change our medicine systems, and really come into play in any of the larger food systems and medicine systems that we can participate in. So thank you, Janie, for that. And I encourage folks to, if you have thoughts as we go through, please feel free to share them in the chat, and I'll make sure that they get some attention. I also have a request, if I may, which is if you are in a space where you're comfortable having your video on, that you turn your video on, just because sometimes I feel when I'm doing these Zoom classes, I'm really used to teaching in person. And sometimes I feel like I'm just talking to my computer. So I love to be able to see folks and see your reactions and see that you're real people on the other side of the internet. And so thanks for folks who are chatting, and thanks to anyone who decides they want to turn their video on. I appreciate it. And let's see, we have another thing to share from the discussion here from Lou, who says, seeking organics and freedoms from unsustainability and factory farming. Thank you. And factory farming is really a perfect example of how these relationships play out in our relationships to animals that we are eating as well, and that there's often a lot of violence and harm within those factory farm systems that are mediating a relationship to the animals that we eat. So thank you, Lou, for that. And so again, I'm not showing this slide to say that no one should ever go to the grocery store or buy clothes, but to highlight that there are a lot of commercial interests that are kind of in between us and the plants that we use, and that sometimes there are ways to have more of a connection with those plants, even if they're foods that we're buying from the grocery store or medicines that we're getting from someone else, that sometimes there are ways to deepen those connections with those plants, even as we are accessing them through some of these same major distributors or major ways of obtaining what we need. Because let's be honest, it's really hard to get what you need in the current economic system without buying it. So again, not a shaming, but just a questioning, or a questioning of how can we still take care of ourselves in the ways that we're able to, but also have deeper connections. And so one of the ways that I think is important to start thinking about our relationship to plants is just by going back in our minds to into the depths of human history, and thinking about how plants have actually created us as a species. They've actually made us who we are as humans. And for me, that's a really powerful thing to think about, because in a climate where I do feel like a lot of disconnection from plants, and where there is a lot of this commodification and prioritization of which information is important, We don't often think about how, as we evolved as a human species, that plants have been our food and our medicine and our shelter and our pretty much our everything for that entire history. Going back to the idea that our very, very, very deep in history ancestor, which would have been just a small multicellular organism, lived in a world where there was not an oxygen-rich atmosphere. And when plants started to grow and thrive and become really one of the dominant forms of life on this planet, they were the first form of life to put oxygen into the atmosphere and completely changed the Earth based on that process. And so before plants were on this planet, we did not have very much oxygen at all, and oxygen was actually toxic to most life. And so you can see the residues of that in the vast array of anaerobic bacteria that are still on the planet. But before plants, that was the norm. That was kind of what life was like. And as plants put more and more oxygen into the air, we got to the place where we have the atmosphere that we now know and love that is very oxygen rich. And that's, that really speaks to our most basic body processes, or most basic like fundamental metabolism is a process that requires oxygen for life. And so we have even that most basic process because of how plants changed our environment before, long before we were human. And then as we go forward in the process of evolution, as we developed from multicellular organisms to more and more complex organisms involving differentiated organs and tissues, and all the way through the process of becoming the organisms that we are today, and this is true of all other organisms on this planet as well, that all of our organs and tissues evolved alongside and in the context of many different plant chemicals. And so some of that means that obviously we use plants to make the structures of our bodies. So we use carbohydrates and proteins and fats that all originated from plants to build the structures that make our bodies. And that's been true for the entire history of organisms since plants became a form of life.
Hello, class.
Hi.
Hi. Holly
Hello.
just asked me to tell you all that she had a problem with her computer and that she'll be back in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Anytime I can be of service.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi there, everyone. Sorry about that. I should have warned you that sometimes I have a little computer trouble when I'm running Zoom and PowerPoint at the same time. I'm glad everyone stuck around, and sorry for the interruption. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, which will just take a second because the document is recovering. Finish that up. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. Thanks for your patience. So we were on the subject of how our tissues have developed basically not just in the context of the macronutrients that we need to actually build our tissues, but also in the context of what are called plant secondary metabolites, which are compounds that plants make not just to do their own basic metabolism or to do their basic metabolic processes, but they make a lot of other compounds for other purposes that are sort of offshoots of those cycles, those metabolic cycles. And those compounds include lots of things that we consider phytonutrients, vitamins, and then also lots of compounds that have more complex interactions with our bodies. And those are where things that we consider herbal medicines come into the picture. A lot of plants make compounds to fend off harm in the form of animals eating them, or to fend off harm from radiative damage from the sun, etc. And so all of the more complex compounds that come from plants that we think of either as nutrients or poisons or medicines or somewhere in between those different categories, those have all shaped us and shaped who we are as humans as well throughout the entire history of humans and pre-humans and the organisms that we evolved from. And I think it's just really powerful for me in my relationship to plants to take a minute every day and to think about that, and to think about how it is not a coincidence that we have lots of receptors in our bodies that not only bind to compounds that we make in our own bodies, but that also can bind to compounds that plants make, and that's not a coincidence. That those receptors and different pathways in the human body that can interact with plant compounds are like that because of a very in millions and millions of years of back and forth with plants as organisms that we consume and that we put into our bodies. And one example that I think is really neat of that is thinking about our taste buds, and in particular about the bitter taste buds that we have. So our capacity to taste bitter is a complicated, it's kind of like a complicated question as to why we taste bitter things but still consume them. So bitter is often a signal that something is poison. And so one of the reasons why people think we have bitter taste buds is that we have evolved to be able to taste things that might be poisonous to us when we eat various plants. And so we know that if something is bitter, that there's a possibility that it's poison. But then also we need bitter things in order to function at our optimal levels, especially in our digestive system. But we have those bitter taste receptors on our tongue in order to detect when something bitter is coming into the body and to potentially detect when something is poison. But if we don't get stimulation from those bitter compounds in plants on our bitter taste receptors, a lot of times what we see is digestive dysregulation. And so if we eat a diet that's completely devoid of bitters, sometimes we have fewer enzymes secreted into the digestive system, or sometimes we have less neurological regulation of the processes of digestion, the coordinated muscle movements that move food through the digestive system, the neurological signalings that tell us when food is coming and what is coming from one digestive organ to the other. And so all of that is based on being triggered by bitter compounds from plants that are not necessarily, that are not poisonous, but that do have that same taste that poisons often have. And one of the interesting, just a side note, one of the interesting things about bitter taste receptors is that we don't just have them on our tongue. We have those same receptors throughout
I wonder if she knows.
folks still with me here?
I'm here. This is Janie.
All right, thank you, Janie. I'm gonna share my screen again, and it's not gonna be as good of a view. Oh, the host has disabled participant screen sharing, right? Because I'm a participant now. All right, one more thing. Okay, that should work. Can folks see the? No, I don't see anything.
Got it.
No, I can't see anything.
Oh,
Oh, I'm sorry, everyone.
we're fine. This must be frustrating for you.
It is very frustrating. Thank you. I think I'm just going to leave this one open and talk to you from the one that I had been talking to you from, just in case this keeps happening. I'll be kind of looking at one screen and talking through another screen. So we'll just, this is my first time ever Zooming twice in one Zoom. Okay.
Holly, the last thing I heard you say was that we had taste buds besides on our tongues.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. I was actually just going to ask where you stopped being able to hear. So thanks again for putting up with that. Is the audio working okay now that I'm kind of using a second laptop as the
Yes.
as the audio? You're probably getting a little echo. Okay, so what I was saying is that in addition to those bitter taste receptors that we have on our tongues, in order for us to detect compounds that might be poisonous, we also have bitter taste receptors throughout the rest of our body, which is kind of an indicator there that some of those plants that taste bitter and that we might flag as poison if we only were tasting them for the first time are actually compounds that have wide-ranging effects on the rest of our body. So we have bitter taste receptors in our circulatory systems. We have them in our lungs. A lot of our immune cells also have bitter taste receptors, and those bitter compounds from plants have different impacts on different body systems, depending on the body system and that particular body system's need. And so I think that's just a really interesting example of how our bodies have these very multiplicative relationships with different plant chemicals that, the same chemical in a plant might have various different impacts on different body organ systems. And those are all based on coevolution of plants and people and us consuming them and our bodies interacting with the compounds that make them up. And then the other point here, last on this slide, is that there's a lot of interesting research on the emotional benefits of different plant interactions. And so one being that aromatic compounds from plants. So those are strong smelling compounds that are volatile and that we interact with through our nose, that a lot of times those compounds can have very profound impacts on our emotional states. And that is based on the fact that the smell receptors in our nose often have a kind of fast track to emotional response by being able to kind of sidestep the normal way that we ingest plant compounds, which is by swallowing them and having them go into our bloodstream through our digestive system, but that oftentimes small receptors in our nose trigger a direct response into the limbic system, so the emotional processing system in the brain, allowing some of those aromatic plant compounds to have a very fast and very deep effect on our emotional states. And we'll talk about this more a little bit later. But research on aromatics and the ways that they can impact our brains. Also, there's been some neat modern research, and I want to recognize that these things that I'm about to say are things that people have known for a long time, and so science does not need to confirm that plants are healthy for us and that plants are good for us to see. But it is interesting. It's always kind of a way that in our modern culture, a lot of times we feel like we need to have this information validated by science, and it is again and again validated that there are benefits like decreased levels of anxiety when people can see trees or green space from their homes, or increased academic achievement for children who can see natural spaces or green spaces outside of their windows at school, lower amounts of aggressive crime in neighborhoods, and in the most recent study that came out about this is controlled for various other factors that make neighborhoods different, like access to resources and socioeconomic status, that neighborhoods that have more green space and more trees have fewer incidents of aggressive crime between community members. And so what I'm getting at here is that it is no surprise that plants are good for us to be around, because as a species, we have been around plants for our entire evolutionary history. And so the idea that we can get along without them is a little bit ludicrous, in my opinion. So I do have the chat window open again now. So I know that most of our chats have been about tech issues, but feel free to start shifting now to asking any questions or sharing comments that you want. So I do have that open again. These are a couple of quotes that I think are really interesting to me from a book called, sorry. This is not technical difficulty, this is user error when I'm getting to the wrong slide. A book called Lab Girl by Hope Jaron, who is a researcher who studies plants from a kind of bigger picture perspective than the way most people study plants. So most science that's been done on plants has been pretty reductionist and sort of studying a particular process or a very small relationship in an ecosystem or a particular plant function. And this scientist in particular has dedicated her career to kind of trying to understand plants from a bigger picture perspective. And so one of the quotes here that I really particularly like is, I'll read this for you. Plants are the only things in the universe that can make sugar out of non-living inorganic matter. All the sugar that you have ever eaten was first made within a leaf. Without a constant supply of glucose to your brain, you will die. It's inescapable. At this very moment, within the synapses of your brain, leaves are feeling thoughts of leaves, which I think is just to me, like a kind of shout out to the fact that every process in our brain, including our thought process, is fueled at some point by plant matter, whether that's if you're someone who eats meat, the animals that you eat were eating plants, or in some cases, the animals that you eat were eating animals that were made from plants. And basically everything that we know, everything that we have in our world was once made out of air and soil minerals and water by plants. And so all of the structures that we, with the exception of mineral substances like rock and concrete. For example, the wood that we make our homes out of was once just air and minerals from the soil and water, and plants through a lot of different complicated systems have created almost everything we know out of those substances. And so, one of the, I think, most kind of sort of big picture ways we can think about that is exactly what Hope Jaron is saying here, that even when we're thinking about plants, we're only thinking about plants because we're able to eat plants and they're able to fuel our brains. Here's a picture of that book for anyone who's interested in reading it, Lab Girl. And I'm going to mention another book here that I'll quote later called The Wild Medicine Solution, that speaks a lot to our relationship with plants from an evolutionary perspective and how plants have shaped the processes in our bodies. This is by the author Guido Masse. Both highly recommended books. So I want to switch gears a little bit here, because I don't want to be all doom and gloom about how we're so disconnected and capitalism is destroying our relationships to plants. And I want to shift to talking more about how we can find connection. So we're in relationship with a lot of different plants, whether we think about it on a day-to-day basis or not. And a lot of these things are going to be really simple, things that we can either start doing or things that a lot of us are already doing. And sometimes what it takes is just thinking about them doing them with a little bit more intention, or kind of thinking about the ways that we're doing things a little bit more to expand our minds to include more meaningful relationships with the plants around us. Here are a few plants that I think highlight different ways of kind of having relationships with plants that I want to touch on. Up here on the top left is a picture of a passion flower. This is from my garden, and you can see there's these 3 little bumblebees hanging out on the passion flower. And watching this happen every year in my garden has been really really mood changing and really mind changing. So what happens when passion flower is blooming in the summer is that bumblebees really like it, and they come and they get on the passion flower, and I don't know what happens to them. They get sleepy, they get stoned, they get drunk on fermenting nectar. I don't know what it is, but they fall asleep and they hang out and they cuddle together. And they, you can even, they get so kind of sleepy that you can pet them and they just kind of like, they don't mind, they're just hanging out. You can see that the passion flower is specially designed for these bees. And I'm going to use my mouse to show, here's the bumblebee kind of sliding underneath what looks like a little saddle on the bumblebee's back. And that is the stamen of the passion flower, perfectly positioned to brush pollen onto the bee's back while the bee is diving for nectar down in the center of the flower. And then when the bee goes to visit another passion flower after it takes a nap for a couple of hours, then that back of that bee is perfectly positioned to deposit pollen on the pistil of the next passion flower, which is this other part that's kind of hanging over in the middle of the flower here. And one of the things that this relationship between the bumblebees and the passion flower is really speaking to is that I have a similar relationship to passion flower, and a lot of people do, which is that this is a plant that's really calming. So for a lot of folks who experience anxiety or racing mind or difficulty with sleeping, passion flower is a pretty potent calming medicine. So it can help to calm down racing thoughts, which oftentimes leads to better sleep. And it can help to calm down anxiety, which can then, again, help us have a more present and intentional relationship with the organisms that are around us. And so for me, it's really neat to see that my relationship to passion flower as a user of medicine is very similar to the relationship that these bees have to the passion flower. And that helps me feel more connected to their experience as bees, which I generally don't understand at all as an organism that's so vastly different from them. And also just helps me see that there are ways that plant relationships are repeated in the natural world. And that's another way that helps me feel like it brings me more into a sense that I'm part of that world instead of somebody or something standing apart from it and observing. Another plant here is dandelion, which I already mentioned in the beginning as a plant that's really common in the city. And I think I wanted to highlight this plant on this slide as an example, because I think that dandelion is one of the few plants that almost everyone can recognize. Most people who've had any kind of access to any outdoor space have a memory of playing with dandelions as kids and blowing the seed head and making a wish or picking the sunny yellow flowers. And this is an example of a plant that gets overlooked and underestimated and undervalued, even though we all have access to it. And it's a plant that can really bring us together through that shared experience of having memories or having experiences with the same plant across cultures and across age groups and across economic and geographical differences. And it's also a plant that is really valuable medicine. And you know, a lot of people hate it because they think of it as as an annoying weed that grows in the sidewalks and comes up in the lawns. But it is a plant that a lot of folks, myself included, have really grown to rely on and really grown to care about, even though it's maligned by most gardeners and landscapers and people with lawns. And then the third plant here is golden seal. This is another medicinal plant, and I wanted to highlight this one because this really, the history of this plant on this continent really parallels the history of colonialism on this continent. So this is a plant that was once very, very widespread, very common in the forests on this continent. This and also another plant called American ginseng were two plants that when Europeans came here and started the genocide against Native folks and also the destruction of our native forests, golden seal was found to be a very potent and useful medicine, which made it a very hot commodity. So as the forests were destroyed, golden seal was commercialized, and a lot of golden seal was shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe to be used as medicine. And similarly, American ginseng was also shipped around the world really to be used as medicine. And so as the forests and indigenous people were being attacked in that period, this plant's decline really kind of paralleled the decline of American forests, and now is at the point where you hardly see golden seal at all in the wild because it has been commodified to such an extent that it's been overharvested, its habitat has been destroyed. And so this plant is really a plant for me that I come back to again and again to help me remember that history, which is my history as a white person on this continent. And the fact that a plant that was once seen as an unlimited resource that was, you know, white folks thought that it could never be, there was so much of it that it could never be, its supply could never be ended, is now so rare that that I have only seen this plant a couple of times ever in the wild when it used to really carpet the forest floors. Someone is asking if I could repeat the name of this plant, and it's golden seal. The word golden and then the word seal like a stamp. Yes, golden seal, that's correct, that's Jenny. Yeah. And so this is a plant, so these three plants kind of highlight different ways of thinking about deepening relationships with plants. One is kind of seeing the parallels that we have with other organisms in our ecosystems. One is the connections that we can make with each other, with a dandelion, through our shared experiences around plants. And then the third is really a call out from a plant to respect it and to always think not about what can I extract from this ecosystem, but what kinds of mutual relationships can we have with plants where we're taking care of them instead of just thinking of them as commodity items. I want to pause here to see if there's any thoughts or questions so far. Lou is saying, reminds me of seed saving heirloom varieties with historical value. Yeah, really important there for human plant relationships, and then also for plant diversity when we think about the fact that the genetic diversity of the plants that we grow has been winnowed down so much to make plants kind of easier to market and easier to store. And Janie is asking, it might be helpful to highlight the medicinal values of these featured plants. So I already mentioned passion flower as a calming herb. Dandelion is a really great liver support herb. So I use this plant a lot in my herbal practice to help support healthy digestion for, again, so this has some bitter compounds, which, as I hope that I said before the audio cut out, but before the computer crashed before and not after, bitter compounds do help to normalize digestive function by normalizing secretions of enzymes in the digestive system. So I use dandelion a lot to help normalize digestion, and then also to help support good liver function when I think that someone's liver is not doing a very good job of kind of identifying and metabolizing waste products so that they can be excreted. So I use dandelion a lot in situations where there are unusual rashes or unusual skin conditions that I think come from an underfunctioning liver, and digestive syndromes like chronic bloating and gas or chronic indigestion, where I think that a gentle bitter that's nourishing like dandelion can help to support return to normal function in the system. So one of the most obvious ways that we can connect with plants that I think will be probably pretty obvious to folks who are on this Zoom, because we're all at least interested or maybe practicing as gardeners, is just to cultivate them. And I want to highlight some ways, you know, a lot of us have the privilege to have land that we're able to tend and able to plant what we want. And I know a lot of folks who live in apartment buildings or who don't have yards who are not able to do that. And I have a few ways here of being able to cultivate plants or being able to care for plants. And so that doesn't have to mean that you grow a garden. It might mean that you take care for the plants that are in your life in other ways. So especially for folks who don't have access to their own land, I'm going to give some examples of local urban farms and gardens that people are able to volunteer at. And it's really rewarding to go back to the same plants and the same garden time after time and see how plants are growing and changing and see what they need and what they don't need. So I'll give a few examples at the end of the presentation of places where you can do that. Tending wild plants in your neighborhood. That might mean scattering seeds of plants that you like in places and seeing what happens. It might mean encouraging folks who do have influence over a piece of land, like a tree box or a little park. It might mean encouraging people to let plants be a little bit more wild, or mow a little bit less often, or allow an area for plants to grow and flourish instead of just having grass. One of the things that we can all do, whether we have gardens or not, is to take care of the street trees. And in DC, you can contact the arborists in the Department of Transportation, or you can contact Casey Trees in order to find out how to care for trees. But one of the big ways is that when people plant trees in the streets, they usually they get tended for a year or two by the people who planted them, or by folks in the community who want to see the trees thrive. And then most of the time after that, they kind of get ignored because they're considered to be established. But a lot of those trees do need additional watering. So including those trees that maybe are 5 or 10 years old in your care for trees, instead of just the trees that are freshly planted, can be really helpful in maintaining the health of street trees. And again, going back to that knowledge that trees, even just seeing trees outside of your window, can have a big effect on emotional health. And this is a way that we can give back to those trees. Lou is suggesting grafting fruiting varieties to unfruitful public trees. That's a great idea. I love that. Allowing spaces. So if you do have space in your influence, if you're in charge of a yard or a tree box or a garden in some place, allowing a little bit of space for things to be more wild in that space oftentimes brings more diversity of life into a space. So more insects and birds and pollinators. And so that doesn't mean just like totally stop tending your yard, although that's a great way to let things be wild, but maybe planting some plants that are just there to feed birds or to feed insects, or to attract pollinators or to catch rainwater, might be, one way of allowing for a little bit more of that wild space to come into our cities. One thing that I want to add here for folks who do have the ability to have a little bit more wild cultivated spaces, growing some of those plants. So I mentioned golden seal before as a plant that's in danger of extinction in our forests because of habitat destruction and overharvesting. And you can plant golden seal in a shady spot in your yard or garden, and create a new home for it in a place where it probably grew many hundreds of years ago, and now is having a hard time surviving. We can create space for those plants in gardens or yards where there might otherwise just be grass. Saving and sharing seeds is a great way to tend plants and to focus on our plant relationships, because saving seeds and sharing seeds allows for a kind of exchange of something that's very deeply personal. So a plant that you've grown yourself and maybe have grown for several years or many years, or maybe you got from your friend or your grandma. And sharing seeds is a really great way also of subverting the need to buy things or to rely on bigger companies for our plant-based needs. If you give seeds to your friends and your neighbors, we're really kind of spreading the resources around and helping plants to do one of the things that they most want to do, which is to reproduce and find new places to grow. And so that's a way that really brings together like plants and human culture. Erica is asking where we would find seeds for golden seal. And I think the way that I've had the most success growing this plant is actually getting bare root from somebody who loves this plant so much that he has spent a lot of time growing this and ships roots to people so that they can plant the plant in their own gardens. And I'll put his name and business name in here. If you go to his website, it's not very fancy or flashy or user friendly. You kind of have to like fill out an order form and send it to him, and then he'll respond and make sure he has what you need. But this is a great place. I like to share this resource because this guy loves plants so much and has devoted a lot of his time to their success. So his name is Rod Angeroth. And then the name of his business is Lois Roots in Nebraska. Otherwise, you can get golden seal seeds from Strictly Medicinals, which is a seed company that focuses mostly on medicinal plants. And oftentimes you can get them from Prairie Moon Nursery. And various other native plant companies will ship seeds for golden seal, and in a lot of cases also plants that you can put in your garden. And they do take a little while to get established, but one thing that's nice is that after a while, so I started seeing a few years ago from my plants that are very established in my garden, that they started coming up from seed around the area where the original plants were planted. And so whatever is happening there is something that they like, and so the seeds are germinating in numbers that they have never germinated before, because the patch has gotten pretty established. And thanks, Lou, for sharing that sometimes people are offering seeds on Etsy. That's great. And then sometimes I think it's if you're someone who's a gardener who's tending plants, sometimes you can choose to cultivate a plant just so it can grow without expectation that you're going to harvest it or do something with it. So you can do that just as a gift to the plant itself by saying, I'm not doing this for a transactional reason or for my own benefit, but just so that I can see you thrive. And that's exactly what I do with the golden seal in my garden. I'm just growing it so I can see it thrive. And I don't dig it up or don't use it to make medicine. I just want it to have some space to grow where it doesn't have space now. I've put a few examples of people whose work I think it's good to check out in these slides. And so here is a fellow herbalist from North Carolina named Ricky Bratz, who has an herbal business and tends a garden, who oftentimes posts really great information about plants and cares about plants a lot. So I'm just going to highlight a few people in this presentation, just like the books for y'all to check out. Another way to kind of delve into connecting more with plants is just learning the local flora, learning what plants grow around in our ecosystems, and being able to identify plants and then see them in other parts of the area really allows you to see how they're thriving and when they're not thriving, and what they, what they need for growth, and to be able to know them a little bit better in that way. Here's a list of a few different places or a few different organizations that help people learn about plants that are growing around us. So DC, Maryland, and Virginia each have native plant societies that have regular walks where you can, you can either join the organizations if you have the resources and the memberships are very affordable, or you can just go on the walks. There's not a membership required to join their walks, and you just walk around in an area in the city or outside of the city, and everyone just talks about what plants are growing and shares how to identify them, and really starts to give you a better perspective for when you do see plants in your daily life. You get a kind of better perspective for what they are, and are able to recognize them as individual species, and again, learn more about how they grow and what they need. At the Arboretum, Fern Valley is a really great place. It's one of the collections in the Arboretum, which is the Native Plants Collection, which I'm biased toward because I worked there for a while, a long time ago. But that is a section of the Arboretum that's full of plants from all across the East Coast. And a lot of the plants are labeled, and so you can kind of learn them and see what the ecosystems in different parts of the East Coast might look like, and which plants grow there, and then again start to recognize those plants when you're in other parts of the area. There's a tree-specific book called a DC-specific book called City of Trees by Melanie Chukas Bradley, who's a local naturalist. And that's a good way to get to know the trees that are growing in the city and get to start to recognize them and connect with them more. And then another resource for trees is the Casey Trees Street Trees map, where it's a map where you can zoom in on a particular street or area and click on the different trees, and you'll see information about that tree. And so that's a good way of learning how to identify and get to know the street trees, maybe the ones that you're taking care of, or if you're not taking care of the trees, that's just getting to know the trees that are in your neighborhood. If you have any other resources to share, I'd love to see folks putting them in the chat. Thanks, Teresa, for sharing the Facebook idea, Facebook information about trading cuttings and seeds. Another way of connecting with plants is to think about, going back to that idea that we've been in relationship with plants for our entire history as humans. All of our ancestors and all of the people that we descended from, either blood ancestors or cultural ancestors, have had relationships with plants. And it's very interesting to ask folks in your family or ask people in your community or research through written materials or audio materials which plants have shaped the histories of your own cultures or your own families or your own political histories. And there are really interesting examples of how plants have shaped the world economically, and a lot of times those big picture shapings have impacts on our own family histories. So it's interesting to kind of look into those personal and political and cultural histories and see which plants have been important. And that might be plants that have shaped the world economically, or plants that were important to a group of people for particular reasons. So some examples that I'm thinking of there are, a big picture political change was in the potato famine, which was the reason why some of my ancestors left Ireland and came the group of people who experienced the potato famine in Ireland were relying on the potato for sustenance because of a political situation where they were being made bread, which was a staple of the diet. And when relying on one plant, there was a disease that affected the potato that failed, and a lot of people starved. And so my connection, the reason why some of my people even became settlers in America is because of a particular relationship to a particular plant. And so some questions that you can ask yourself here are: which plants shaped your own histories? Which plants does your culture or cultures currently have relationships with? Which plants are important not just to you personally, but to you culturally? Which plants are important to your family and to other communities you're a part of? And which plants have an impact on you as an individual? And I encourage folks, if you have examples to share, to speak up or to share them in the chats. But I would encourage people, as you do try to explore having more connection to the plants that you're growing or the plants that you're interacting with, to really hold these questions in your mind. Because once you identify a connection, a plant does start to have more meaning and starts to jump out to you and starts to become more of an organism with depth and with history. Just like when you start to get to know a new person, they become a person with more, you learn about their depth and you learn about their history. Over here on the right are Owen Taylor and Chris Bolden Newsom, who have a really amazing podcast called Seeds and Their People. I'll put that in the chat. They tell these really great stories about seeds. So both of them have farms outside of Philadelphia where they grow crops and also save seeds and really focus on culturally important seeds to groups of people who might not have easy access to the seeds that that they use for food or that they have cultural history with. And so really, really neat podcast, and check out their work in general as people who really try to cultivate those more historic and ancestral relationships with plants and support other people who want to have access to the seeds of the plants that are important to them. Anyone want to share an example that they can think of a plant that's important to themselves or to their family or to their culture?
Hi, this is Lou. I'll share that. Well, I'm from LA and I'm half Mexican and half Irish, and I have like a huge relationship with the native Mexican foods and plants that we use for that, right? And I've grown tons of that there in LA. I'm kind of new to DC, so what I've been doing is seeking out things that I could grow here that were important to like African Americans that were enslaved, that maybe were part of their history in Africa that they brought with them, or varieties that were developed here. And one particular one is Aunt Lou's Underground Railroad tomato, which is a seed that someone smuggled with them apparently on the Underground Railroad to Ohio. Mm-hmm. And it's been grown here. And of course, I'm Aunt Lou, so I have to grow it. But a couple others are just, they're widely known. Fish pepper, and also the Bueno Mulatto pepper, which are hot peppers. I'm growing those too. And I'm just, that's a way for me to kind of start using those in cooking and kind of connect to historical cuisine here and culinary traditions of the people that are in this region, as a way for me to get to, I don't know, feel like more part of this place.
Yeah, I like that idea of using food to connect to people, and I hope that that you're finding a lot of reward and meaning from growing those plants. Thanks for sharing those stories. We have Janie is saying golden seal was introduced to our family when we gave birth to our daughter at home. The powder was used as a healing substance for her umbilical cord, which we then used as natural band-aids for all of the children. Wow, that's really neat. Thanks for sharing that, Jamie. And Teresa says, my family has always had aloe plants around for treating skin conditions. Yeah, who, I keep wanting to be like, raise your hand if you have an aloe in your house or if you grew up with an aloe in your house. But I guess I don't know how to make that happen on Zoom, but I think that's another example like the dandelion of a plant that is really common experience to so many different people. It's neat to see how different people use aloe in different ways. And it has different histories and different cultures and different uses in different cultures. And yet it's such a widespread houseplant that that so many people have in their homes. It's a plant that people can really connect around. And I didn't know that about golden seal. I actually do also attend home births. I was at a couple yesterday, and I've never heard of that practice before, so I appreciate you sharing that, Jeannie. And then Janie also mentions cilantro, commonly used in Colombian cooking, my husband's ancestry. Since his passing, I've traveled extensively and fallen in love with northern New Mexico. Their green hatch chili is a staple in my home. Yeah. I'm sorry to hear about your husband's passing, and that's a really, really beautiful example of how a plant can remind us of someone in our own history or someone that we've been close to. A lot of people have plants that they've received from loved ones in their families who have passed, or from a relative who's passed, and so that's a really great example of a really, really emotional and important connection to a plant. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else want to share before we move on? This is another book recommendation to anyone who's thinking about this issue of connecting with plants, and especially around ancestry. And this is a book written by Michelle Lee, who explored a lot of relationships to plants amongst healers in the Carolinas. So she interviewed a whole bunch of elders who've been using plants as medicine in their families and communities for a long time, and really captured a lot of information, not just about how plants were used, but really about the cultural connections and the family connections and the individual connections that people have with the plants that they're engaged with. And so this is a really beautiful book. I actually keep a copy handy in my house so that I can pick it up when I want to read a story about plants. And here is a little excerpt from this book. This is about the idea that people, despite great adversity and violence, can still relate to and still connect to their ancestral plants if there's any possible opportunity. So she says, there is an enduring myth that the moment the African captives stepped off of the jetties onto the holds of the slave ships at locations like the Gate of No Return on Tory Island, Senegal, they lost all direct contact and connection with their African homeland. In fact, while contact was unimaginably difficult, it never ceased. And she does give some examples of African Americans kind of reclaiming African cultures and finding out where their cultural practices came from, and gaining access to those practices. And in particular, she uses this example: many African American spirit and folk medicine practitioners have worked to bridge the old Atlantic gap, delving out the roots of their beliefs and practices on the African continent and merging them into a unified whole. So folks who have been part of a continuous practice of African American medicine on this continent, then going back and learning about the roots of the medicine that they've been practicing through generations and reconnecting that circle. Really, really powerful example of reaching back into ancestral histories to learn more about the connections that people have with plants. I really, really recommend this book a lot. So the next thing I want to talk about in our kind of exploration of ways to connect with plants is the idea of reciprocity. And I like this definition from Merriam-Webster because of the second part. So the idea of mutual dependence really speaks to what our relationship with plants is at its core. So we are, when we're interacting with plants, we are getting, as I mentioned before, we're getting pretty much everything we need from plants to some extent or another, either directly or indirectly. And the idea that we can give back to them, I think, is an idea that is foreign to capitalism, which encourages us just to have an extractive policy towards plants. But the idea of mutual dependence, that we can give back to them, and a lot of plants do depend on people for their continued existence in modern times. And so a lot of the plants that we rely on are crop plants that we eat. And a lot of those plants actually cannot survive without people. So there is a mutual dependence that happens there. Whereas most wild plants, I think, are dependent more, in modern times, they're dependent more on our capacity and willingness to defend wild spaces in order to give them the space that they need to maintain their own populations. But I really like that idea of mutual dependence when it comes to thinking about reciprocity. And here is I think the person who has taught me the most through her writing about reciprocity and the idea of giving back to plants is Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'm sure a bunch of you have read. And I'll just read the beginning of this. Though the earth provides us with all that we need, we have created a consumption-driven economy that asks, what more can we take from the earth? And almost never, what does the earth ask of us in return? And she goes on to just express the idea that the earth asking of something, asking us for something in return is such a sweet and gratifying idea that we might have something to give back for all that we receive. I can't recommend this book more, so I'll just leave it at that. But the idea of reciprocity, again, is kind of foreign to the fundamentals of capitalism, and I think it's really helpful for me to take a step back and think, what do plants want? And this is, it's hard because, wanting for a plant is different from wanting for a human. We don't really understand how plants express needs, or how, we don't understand the inner workings of plants at all. And they don't have brains and nervous systems the same way that we do, but they are living beings, and asking what they want might be a little bit of anthropomorphism, but it's the way that we can kind of understand the idea of reciprocity is what do other organisms need and what can we offer to them. But really, we're only guessing based on our observations of plants. But I'm pretty sure that what plants want is space to grow, which we've already kind of talked a little bit about with the idea of tending plants in our lives. Seed dispersal and other reproductive assistance, so root cuttings, plant cuttings. One of the things that I do for a lot of the plants that I rely on as an herbalist is I try to think, where could these plants grow that they're not, and spread some seeds. I often give seeds to people, not as a, not something that I ever accept money for, so not as a business, but just as an offering. So I think, these plants have done a lot for me, what can I do for them? And one of the things that I can do for them is offer their seeds so that they might have new spaces to grow. Oops. And so dispersing their seeds, whether that means kind of scattering seeds in a place that they might grow, or giving seeds again, and then you're sharing sharing seeds with other people and creating that connection with other people around plants. I think that plants want to be composted, and I try to keep that in my mind. You know, I think composting is great. I think composting is, you know, necessary to reduce food waste, and I think it's important in those ways. But I also think that it's a gesture to the plants that I rely on to recognize that they're part of a life cycle, and that if they get the opportunity to go back into the soil and to grow, you know, for their resources to be used by other organisms to grow, then that is kind of keeping them in their own cycle of life. Whereas if they get put into the landfill, I think one thing a lot of people don't understand about compost is that if you put compostable things, including things like compostable bags and silverware, but also if you put food waste into a landfill, it doesn't have everything it needs in order to turn back into soil. So it doesn't compost in the landfill. It needs certain bacteria, and it needs heat, and it needs more plant matter around it in order to create the proper conditions for composting. And I'm sure there's a lot of y'all who know a lot about composting here and understand that can't happen in a landfill. And so putting plant matter back into the life cycle feels like a really important gesture to the plants that I care about, beyond just reducing food waste and creating healthy soil. It feels like a very symbolic gesture to say, I understand that you're part of a cycle that's bigger than me, and I would like you to stay part of that cycle. I think that plants want to be left alone sometimes, and I try to be aware of that as someone who harvests a lot of plants. I think that sometimes they want to be left alone and sometimes they want to be harvested, and it's hard to know sometimes which is which, but I think for me it's important always to ask and to listen. And they don't, you know, they don't speak up and say like, oh, harvest me. But oftentimes I get a sense, and whether that's coming from my own subconscious or whether that's coming from something outside of my brain, I just don't know. But I try to listen to whatever messages I'm getting when I'm thinking about harvesting or asking if I'm going to harvest something that I didn't grow myself. And I know that plants, if they want anything in our human ideas of what wanting is, that they want to be protected from the onslaught of development and habitat destruction. And so going back to plants want space to grow, they also want their space to grow not to be destroyed. And so any way that you have to influence the kind of increased urban sprawl, or any way that you have in your world to exert even a small influence on deforestation or you know, development of wildlands, please take that effort as much as you can. Anyone have other ideas here about ways to kind of intuit or know what plants want and give back to them? You're welcome to share in the chat or to just speak up. The next thing I want to talk about in relating to plants is practices of gratitude. And this is something that, again, like a lot of these other things, I think this gets washed away in the kind of commercialization of most of our basic needs. But the expression of gratitude just means pausing for a moment to say thank you in your mind, or say thank you out loud to whatever it is that you're relying on. And in a lot of cases, that, you know, in a lot of cases that means plants. So plants that we're eating or using as clothing or shelter, or using to beautify our homes or our gardens. Just and for me, this has been, again, alongside the idea of reciprocity, this has been one of the most powerful ways that I have felt more connected to the plants that I'm in relationship with, is just taking a minute to recognize them and say, thank you for nourishing me. Thank you for clothing me. Thank you for making me happy. I think about this a lot when I'm biking around the city and seeing the street trees and recognizing how much they make our city more beautiful and make my mind calm. And so I will thank them for that when I'm riding my bike. And so this, doesn't have to be something that is a big production. It might just be every once in a while taking a moment mentally or out loud to say thanks for the plants that we rely on. And I want to say too that that expressing gratitude is actually really good for you. There's a lot of research on how a regular gratitude practice really improves mental health. People report feeling happier, report better self-esteem, report better perception of their physical health. Whether their physical health is different or not, people perceive their physical health as better, which is really actually a powerful way of having a better, more comfortable experience on a day-to-day basis. And it also facilitates healthier relationships. All of this is about gratitude. The research has been done on gratitude toward people, so expressing gratitude for other people. But I think it is very reasonable to extend that to plants, that a lot of these benefits to us can be assumed if we have a regular practice of expressing gratitude to the plants that we eat or use as medicine or rely on in other ways. My favorite title of a study that I read when I was reading about this issue was, it's called An Upward Spiral Between Gratitude and Humility. And going back to the concepts or the forces, the cultural forces that I started with in this presentation, capitalism and settler colonialism and white culture hegemony, humility is one of the basic things that is lacking from all of those forces. And so any way that we can use gratitude both to improve our own well-being and then also to enhance a sense of humility, which then kind of helps us check ourselves when we're thinking of something as a commodity or thinking of something as a resource to be exploited. The more we can tend our sense of humility in the face of the amazing living world that's around us, the better. So I like that those two things go hand in hand. I'm wondering if anyone wants to share any of the ways that they have found in their own lives to practice any of this, either reciprocity or gratitude or any kind of practice related to these things. Speak up if you want or share in the chats. I'm sensing or I'm seeing that this is not a very talkative group, but I would love to hear from you if you have anything to share, any recommendations for other folks or for me to learn from something that you have found powerful. I'm gonna give a second for folks to share in the chat or speak up. And I also want to recommend Toy Scott's work at queerherbalism.blogspot.com, who shares a lot of information about cultural histories and gratitude, and also runs a school teaching Black and Indigenous folks about herbal medicine, both from a medicinal and also from a cultural perspective of reclaiming ancestral practices. So I'll give a second for folks to share if they would like to.
Hi, yeah, this is Lou. I'll share something. In my garden with the things that I grow, because I grow food mostly, right? But I always include flowers, a lot of them. And one of the things I do with the food I grow too, though, is I always will let at least one of the plants that I'm growing go to flower. So if I've got like a whole plot of lettuce or a whole plot of, a whole area of radishes or whatever, I'll let one of them at least go so that I can experience the entire beauty of the plant and not just, consume it and then pull it out of the ground and get rid of it. But also so that the, pollinators and such can also experience it as well, so that we're sort of going through the entire cycle of the plant and letting it go to seed, even if I don't want the seeds or I have seeds. It's just, that's one way I recognize what I'm getting from the plants I'm growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really beautiful. And you learn so much more about them that way too. So that's a really good example of something that you give to a plant that really gives back to you as well. So again, that mutual dependence or reciprocity is really great.
Thank you.
Want to share here? I'll share one thing that that I do sometimes with when I'm eating food, and that is to take a moment when I'm someone who has developed an unfortunate habit of eating fast and always being kind of in a hurry. And one of the things that I try to do is slow down and really taste the food that I'm eating and think about the plant that it came from, and close my eyes for a minute and imagine what that plant's life was like and what its experience was like. So I imagine what it felt like for the sun to be shining on the plant and for the plant to be growing and for it to be kind of rooted in place during rainstorms and different kinds of weather patterns. And I find that that is a way that really helps me to appreciate the plants that I'm eating instead of just kind of gobbling them up very quickly and kind of moving on, is to remember that they are alive and that they have had a life before they got to my plate, and that they had a lot of different experiences that I might not be able to relate to, but I do know what it feels like to have the sunshine on my skin, and I know what it feels like to be wet from the rain, and that's a way that I can connect to them as one living being to another when they're actually becoming a part of my body.
I'll share something that I recently learned in a session that I was in with Miriam Perez. She runs a website called Houseplant Parenthood, and she's amazing. And I was recently in a workshop, and she talked about how when we're checking on our plants, just seeing how they're doing. And maybe we see that they need more water, or we've overwatered, or something that's happening with the leaves and we need to do research about what's happening, if there's a pest that's kind of getting at them. And it can remind you to check on yourself in the same way without judgment. If you're feeling tired, if you're feeling thirsty, have you drink enough water? And so I think that piece of checking on yourself without judgment as you check on your plants was really insightful for me, because often if I'm thinking like, oh, I'm really tired today, that means I didn't get enough sleep last night and I didn't do my, good bedtime routine. And I go into a lot of this judgment. So that activity that was run during that workshop was really amazing. And so now every time I'm kind of watering and checking on my plants, whether it be like the tomatoes I'm growing outside or house plants, I do a little check-in with myself, and it's just become a great practice.
Thank you for sharing that. That's so great. I have not heard that before, and I love it. For those who didn't hear, I put Miriam's or Perez's name into the chat, and the Houseplant Parenthood is the name of that project. So that is another plant nerd that you should definitely check out. Thank you for bringing them up.
Hi, Holly.
Hi.
Hi, it's Erica.
Oh, hi, Erica.
Hi, I was just thinking, it was taking me a minute to really see where I experience gratitude with plants. Even though I was raised with plants in the house, I was raised with my grandma having a huge garden, and later my mom having a garden. I was trying to see like where the gratitude came in, and if I was totally missing that piece. And then I'm still thinking on it, but I started thinking like my mom talks to her plants all the time, and she talks to even things that aren't living, like thanking them or, oh, I'm sorry, and that kind of thing. And so I'm like, I know it's innately in me because, I know that in my mind, I'm doing similar things because of living with her and being around her so much.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really taking me a minute to really see where that experience is coming in with me. And being raised also to pray before meals was a huge thing to say. I'm thankful for my food, but I'm also thankful for the person who interacted with the food.
Mm.
And also, I think as I became an adult, I decided at some point I used to water. We had a lawn, and I would sit out and water it, which is probably wasteful in thought, but that was literally the way I was connecting.
Mm.
And I still do. I noticed today I was watering things in the garden, and I brought my chair like I would normally, and just really, and that's when bugs come to get a drink, I noticed, and I would make it puddle so that there would be a drink. But it took a while for me to really see that maybe I am connecting in a way that's other than I need this so that I can eat it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I really appreciate that. And I like that that also gives an example of how these things, it doesn't have to be like a big production or like something that you kind of like step outside of your normal practices or normal comfort zones to do. It can be, so the act of sitting with the grass, if you're watering the lawn and watering it, is something that can feel like a connection if you're paying attention instead of just being like, oh, I'm going to turn the sprinkler and run away. And so that's a perfect example there of how some like really, really simple things like even chores can have possibility in them for feeling more connected and feeling that sense of gratitude. So I really appreciate that a lot. Thank you, Erica.
Hi, Holly.
Hi, are you blushing, Doris?
Yes. This is the mother that talks to plants. But my plants take such better care of me than I do of myself. Every year, whatever my body is lacking will grow in my yard. This year, I have comfrey going everywhere. Some years I have red clover. It's whatever my body sends out to the plants, to the plant world. The plants say, okay, well, we're going to give this to her because we love her. And they give it to me, they in abundance. But and yeah, so I have to talk to them. I have to thank them. I have to let them know I appreciate how they look out for me. And that's that.
Thank you, Doris. Thank you. I appreciate that. They're definitely always taking care of us. And thank you for teaching your kids to talk to them and to take care of them in return. One of the other things I think is important when we're thinking about our own relationships with plants is to take a step back and really take a moment to value non-human relationships with plants. One of the things that's been the most profound about tending the same garden space for the last 10 years for me is watching how other organisms interact with the plants that I care about, and recognizing that it's not all about me, but that sometimes I can just take a moment to feel inspired by and to feel happy for the relationships that other organisms have with the plants in my garden or the plants that are around me. And so all of these, with the exception of the cicada in the top middle, these are all animals that I have seen relating to plants in my garden. And so it's both a treat to see such a diverse space where there's a lot of different plants and a lot of different animals working with, or in some cases working against those plants, but there's a thriving variety of life that surrounds the plants that we interact with, and we're often we don't take a moment to recognize that diversity of life that is supported by the plants that are around us. We have a comment from Teresa. I started vermicomposting in April and it has been a very interesting learning process. I highly recommend. DC has a rebate program for anyone interested in purchasing a vermicompost system, although you can make your own system with very little money and supplies. Also, now I just think worms are cute. Thank you for that. That's great. Great way of composting in an indoor space too, if you don't want to, if you don't have the ability to compost outside. I do want to mention too, now that you brought composting up again, that you don't have to do it in your own space. There's a lot of places where you can bring your compost at farmers markets and at some of the Department of Parks and Recreation sites. You can sign up to be able to drop your compost off at some of those sites, or you can bring it to most farmers markets and farmers will take it back to their farms. One of the other ways that we relate to plants is through ritual and ceremony. Some of these are practices that people learn through the generations from family members or from members of spiritual communities or religious communities, etc. But also these are sometimes ways that we can learn to interact with plants in new ways if they're not already, if this isn't already part of our practices. So some of the ways that, and I want to say that there's a lot of information out there about like the meanings of plants and which plants are right for which kinds of ceremonies and rituals, and that changes from culture to culture and from person to person. And there isn't a plant that is the right one for everyone. I'm sharing some of my favorite plants here to use for marking important times of the year or important moments. But that doesn't mean they have to be your favorite plants. And I think that what really makes a plant meaningful in these kinds of moments is a relationship, not a piece of information that you read on the internet about what a plant is good for. So some of the ways that that I have used plants for more kind of ritual purposes are burning, or kind of using smoke to change a moment or to change the kind of way people are feeling in a space. And herbs that I like there are rosemary and willow and mugwort and pine or other conifer resins. And I'll touch on aromatic plants again in a second. Bathing, and this is especially helpful for folks who experience a lot of anxiety or need a kind of a water-based practice in order to help them feel grounded. Symbolic plants that you might plant in a garden or place around a home. And one thing that is important in interacting with plants in this way is to always harvest them with gratitude and intention. When I think that a lot of ritual and ceremonial use of plants has become very commodified. It's like there's a phenomenon where plants are kind of marketed as meaningful plants, and you have to buy them and then you can use them for these reasons. But really, most of the practices that most of the scenarios that those practices come from is really based on close, meaningful relationships with living plants that are harvested in a particular way. And one of the ways that we can have meaningful relationships with those plants is to learn about them, sit with them, and harvest them with gratitude and intention. And most of the time throughout history and across different cultures around the world, some of the most important plants in ritual and ceremonial use are aromatic plants. And going back to what I was saying earlier about how aromatics can really trigger emotional responses by going directly to the limbic system in our brains. That's one of the reasons why we use aromatic plants in ritual and ceremony, because they help bring people together in a particular moment. And sometimes they help to make an emotional shift in order to create an appropriate space for marking an important moment in time. Another factor there is that smells have strong mental associations and can trigger emotions and can trigger memories. And so sometimes they bring a sense of timelessness into a ritual where that smell is associated with a certain time of year or a certain moment or a certain, particular type of ritual. And so you start to associate that smell, and it really brings you into the mental and emotional space that way. I'm gonna skip this slide here because we're running short on time, and I have a couple of other things that I wanted to mention. Thanks to Janie for the more information about vermicomposting. But I want to, in talking about ritual and ceremony, I want to address one of the things that I think is really, really important to hold in our minds during in thinking about like creating and using plants this way, which is the idea of cultural appropriation. I know that everyone on this call or on this class might have a different relationship to the concept of cultural appropriation and different relationships to different cultures. So I want to recognize that. And I also want to lift up the idea that that cultural appropriation in its sort of basic definition is the harmful use of a cultural or spiritual practice by a dominant culture that belongs to a culture that is marginalized by the dominant culture. And so a very common example is the appropriation of Native spiritual practices by white people, which Native folks have continually asked asked folks not to do, and have expressed that it harms their communities and spiritual practices. And so I think it's important to bring this up in talking about developing or using plants in ritual and ceremony, because we all have the capacity to create our own relationships with plants and interact with them in this way by using them ceremonially or ritually without doing harm to people whose spiritual practices might be at risk because of appropriation. So another couple of points here are that the practice of cultural appropriation does harm to the marginalized group while benefiting the dominant group. So people might make money. So one way that this looks is plants being sold by non-native owned businesses or companies to make a profit. And in particular, an example that's come up a lot lately is large companies selling white sage for ritual cleansing purposes, which leads to overharvesting of white sage in its native environment, which is in the southwest of the United States, where indigenous communities who have many, many, many generations of relationship with that plant now are often finding they don't have access to the plant. That's the basis of a lot of spiritual practices there because of the commodification of that plant. And so I'm gonna, I think this is a really important topic, and I do want to give it a lot of attention, but I also know that we're kind of very short on time. So I am going to send these slides out to Josh to send to all of you. And I want to lift up the work of Loba, whose internet handle is at La Loba Loca Shares, who has a lot of really important things to say about this topic. And I encourage you to read and support their work. So here's a couple examples of commodification of plants that are used in indigenous spiritual practices that have led to those plants being endangered or threatened or hard to access for indigenous communities. When we're surrounded by plants that can be used in the same way, so going back to the plants that I mentioned, mugwort and rose and rosemary being some important plants for me that have both cultural significance for the cultures that I come from, and then also personal significance because they're plants that I've been interacting with for a long time and have those direct relationships with the living plants, and I'm able to harvest them myself and in a way that feels very meaningful. This is a series of questions that you can use to discover what your own plant connections are. And I'm sorry that we're going to go a few minutes over, but I had those like last 10 minutes of time. So I totally understand if folks need to drop off, and you can check out the slides later. But I kind of lost those 10 minutes. So I want to just kind of go through the last little bit of stuff that I have for you here. But I totally understand if folks need to leave. But there are some questions you can ask yourself in order to try to discover what connections you have with plants already existing in your life. That doesn't need to be kind of like a whole new project that you take on. So wondering which plants you see or encounter on a regular basis and which ones you already feel connected to. And they can be plants that seem kind of boring, like dandelions, like I already mentioned, or like Erica mentioned, feeling that connection from watering the lawn. That is not an insignificant thing. It doesn't have to be like a exotic, fancy plant that that gets a lot of credit for being like different and unusual. Observing the plants, how do they grow? What kinds of life does it support, and what does it teach you? What can you learn about how it grows? Find out if those plants have any historical or cultural significance for you. And if they don't, it's fine. You can always forge new relationships with plants. What's important is that you feel the connection. And also, a lot of people don't necessarily have a way of finding out what historical or cultural significance a plant might have for them. And that's okay too, because that doesn't mean that you can't have connections with plants that are in your life. You can always wonder, how can I support this plant? So going back to that idea of reciprocity, and then hang out with it, watch and listen and see what you notice, see what you observe, see how you feel when you're in the same space as the plant and paying attention to it quietly for a while. And then ask yourself, in what ways can I incorporate this plant into my life? Wonder and ask if it's okay to harvest it, and if so, what happens next? And that's going to look different for every person. But again, the important thing is really delving into these connections by observation and by sitting or being with a plant and really learning from it, versus using a plant that is the right plant to use for a particular situation. I'm gonna skip this actually, because we kind of covered this already. So I'm gonna go past this slide. And I wanna end with recommending a few places where there are really great variety of plants and where there's some kind of more wild type spaces that folks can visit who wanna spend time with learning about different plants and observing them and making connections with them, especially for folks who don't have a lot of space to grow your own plants, but even for those of you who do. So I have plenty of space to grow medicinal herbs, and I still like to visit these places when I'm around the city, because I find that I learn different things, I see different things, I see different plants, and I have different experiences at all of these spaces. These aren't all spaces where I spend a lot of time, but they're all places that are accessible to the general public through volunteering, or in some cases through just being able to go hang out there. And the first one is Wangari Gardens, which folks might be familiar with, because I think that the DPR classes have sometimes hold classes here. And this is by Washington Hospital Center. And this space has a community garden where people have individual plots. And then it also has a small food forest garden and an herb and food garden that is open to the general public, where people can volunteer and tend to plants and then also harvest plants. And there's a really great amount of medicinal plants growing here too, to be able to explore in the medicinal plant garden. Here are some pictures. This is the community garden, and here's some pictures from the more wild forest food garden that's behind the community garden. Just some interesting plants that are growing there. This is the Ark Farm, which is connected to the Ark Community Center. And this farm was started, gosh, I can't remember how many years ago now, but a bunch of years ago. And they grow food and have a CSA that helps to provide fresh vegetables in an area where there's not always a ton of fresh veggies available. And also they have a good amount of kind of more pollinator attracting plants, and there are a lot of kind of like small patches of forest nearby. So there's a lot of diversity of different kinds of spaces here where you can spend time volunteering and being with plants. And here's a picture up top of the pollinator and medicinal plants garden. You can see there's a pretty great diversity of plants here that host a lot of different kinds of insects, and then backdropped by the crop fields, and then also the forest behind there. This is a great place to go and kind of sit with plants and learn about different kinds of plants. The farm at Kelly Miller is a pretty new farm that is managed by Violet King, who's a friend and fellow herbalist, who really knowledgeable farmer and an herbalist. And this is another example of a public-private partnership, or a nonprofit government partnership. So the Kelly Miller School and Dreaming Out Loud have come together to run a farm on the school property. And there's again, diversity of plants here, and a couple of times a week when people can volunteer if you don't have a chance to spend time tending plants in your own space. This is a place where you can go and do that in another space. And here is Violet with a bunch of different greens that are growing at the Kelly Miller farm. Again, Violet is a fellow herbalist and a farmer, really knowledgeable, and this is a lovely place to spend some time. And then the last example I'm going to give is Common Good City Farm and the Tricia McCauley Memorial Garden. So there is a small urban farm inside of a fence here that has opportunities for volunteering. And I should say that all of these, right at this particular moment during the pandemic, all of these farms are having very limited, or in some cases no, volunteer hours. So this is going to be kind of like future, for future reference. But you can always contact them and find out if there are any current volunteer opportunities. And then also as things open up at some point or another in this world, these are good places to go to. Wangari Garden and this site outside of the fence at Common Good City Farm, there's a new garden there that just got installed last year that is for anyone to come participate in, to do some weeding, some watering, and also harvest some medicinal and culinary herbs. So in this picture here, there's a big square, which is the farm, which has volunteer programs. And then down here, you can't see it because this picture was taken before the garden was installed, but down here is a new garden that was installed in honor of a friend and fellow herbalist who was murdered a bunch of years ago. And so her memorial garden is full of medicinal and culinary herbs and is explicitly open for people to interact with. And there is free and easy access to that at all times. So here on the bottom left is a picture of the garden being installed. And these other pictures are from Common Good. There's a lot of fruiting trees at that farm, a lot of vegetables, and a medicinal herb garden in there as well. So I'm just going to end with a couple of lists of resources. The books that I mentioned in the presentation are here, and then also another few books that I think are, I really kind of speak to the relationships that we have with the plants around us. And so I encourage you to explore these and read them and share them with other people in your lives who love plants. And again, I'll send the slides to Josh to send to you, so you don't have to screenshot them or write them down. You will have these resources. And then here are some websites also that I think are really useful in this question of how we relate to plants, and help us explore both the local flora and also the ways that we can learn how to respect and feel grateful for the plants that are in our lives. So I'm going to end here. I will stay on a little bit if folks have any questions. I know, again, we're over time, so folks can feel free to leave as they please, but I'll stay on for another few minutes and see if there's any residual questions or anything folks want to share. I also want to share my contact info. So I have an apothecary in Columbia Heights that is not now open to the public, but generally I do have open hours there on Wednesdays. but anyone can reach out if they're interested in exploring medicinal herbs in any way. And I'm going to leave my contact up here at the end. Please feel free to be in touch. I like to interact with people around plants. So if you want to share something or take a picture of an unknown plant and ask me what it is or ask questions, please feel free to be in touch. So I'll thank you all for being here and for putting up with the technical difficulties. I hope that you'll find ways to take care of yourselves in this time when there's a lot of grief and pain and anger happening. I think there's also a lot of really amazing things happening right now. And may you all find what you need to be safe and active and to take care of the people in your communities. So thanks, and I will stick around for some questions or comments, and I will hopefully see some of you in real life sometime when we're able to do that kind of thing.
Thank you so much, Holly.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here, Erica.
And I would love to come on Tuesdays. Whenever I'm not sure when you're having volunteers.
Let's email about that separately.
Okay.